So something important to understand is why we even bother to calculate a price index. Why does it matter what the price levels are? Well, there's a few reasons. So the first is to calculate inflation. I'm not going to show you how to calculate inflation right now because it's not terribly difficult. Um, it's just percent change in CPI. So the same way that we calculated economic growth by doing percent change in GDP, we do the same thing calculating percent change in CPI. So for example, if I wanted to calculate inflation in the year 2000, I could do the new price index minus the old price index divided by the old price index. So 172 minus 166 divided by 166 times 100 gets you about 3.4% inflation. Okay, so that's important for us to be able to track inflation. It's going to be very important for reasons we'll talk about later. It's also important to convert nominal variables to real variables, being able to adjust things for inflation. There's all sorts of times where people try to use nominal values when making historical comparisons, and it's just silly, okay? Something that, we talked about in the millions, nowadays, might be in the billions or even trillions, okay? So we have to be very careful about using the right, really talking about things in terms of real value as opposed to nominal values that are made by inflation. So I'm going to show you a video on how to convert present day prices to old prices and vice versa, as kind of a here's how we do that. There's also something called cost of living adjustments. Now, this can be very important, especially if things are in terms of like a law where people are getting a certain amount of money over time. If you make that a fixed amount of money, then as inflation happens, that bill kind of becomes outdated, where the amount of money that you're getting is not really what you need. You need that amount of money probably to increase as inflation increases. So what some laws or some contracts do is they tie that amount of money to a price index, which allows for an automatic cost of living increase over the life of that contract or over the life of that law. Now, we have to be careful because then all of a sudden, that price index has very important real-world consequences. So people, if we're not careful, will politicize how those things are calculated. All right. Most commonly used price index is called the CPI-U, Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. So it's tailored towards city living rather than rural living. They use kind of an average of the prices from 1982 to 1984. So if you wanted to call 1 year our base year, it would be 1983. Okay, and you can see this table that gives you the values of the CPI over time. So if you notice, around 1983, it's about 100, which is what we would expect from our base year. And we can see around 1974, 1975, it was around 50. So actually in those 10 years, prices almost doubled. There was rampant inflation. We can see that because of these big inflation numbers, 10%, 13%. Okay, huge inflation numbers. That's because we went off the gold standard. We had oil embargo, all sorts of nasty stuff going on. Nowadays, we don't really see very heavy inflation, or at least we haven't. Very low. You'll see that sometimes we actually see deflation, which is price levels decreasing. You'll normally see this happen during demand-based recessions. So here during the 2008 recession, we saw prices drop. You can see here 1931, 1932, 1933, we see big, nasty deflation. And this was caused by the Great Depression, okay? Real nasty stuff going on there. Now, I mentioned that we had huge inflation when we went off the gold standard. A lot of people go, well, Mr. McClung, we should get back on the gold standard. We'd have more stable currency. Well, you'll notice we have fairly stable currency, okay? Very, very low levels of inflation. And look at these years, before we got off the gold standard. Huge inflation, huge deflation, huge fluctuations, okay? Being on the gold standard does not mean that you're going to have a stable currency, okay? You can have fiat currency and still have it be fairly stable, but you have to show a lot of discipline in your monetary policy, which is something that we'll talk about later. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about some of the issues that we have with measuring CPI.